We've now come to Pisidia's best-kept secret, Sia, the city in the forest, which I warn all potential visitors is almost impossible to find. You can probably see behind me trees and stones. The fact that this is a city built on a hill slope covered with pine trees meant that it's very well preserved, because the trees have prevented easy access to the place. People haven't come here, they haven't robbed out the stone. Buildings have collapsed, but most of the remains are to be seen all around us. We know the place was called Sia because of inscriptions found here. In fact, precisely on the monument behind me, where you can read that these statue bases for Roman emperors were put up by the people of the Sienoi, the people of Sia. But otherwise it's a place completely unknown to history. It doesn't appear in any ancient account of the region, and was discovered at the end of the 19th century by a French traveller who noted the inscriptions, was revisited in the 1950s, and then we came back in the 1990s to make a plan of the site. And the reason we picked it was because of the very good state of preservation of the buildings, the tombs, the temples, the houses, the fortification walls, cisterns, probably a small bathhouse, a meeting place, bouleuterion or similar structure. So Sia in fact does have everything that you would expect from a mountain city in this region. It was also extremely difficult to work at, because in a deep forest like this with very difficult sight lines, you can't survey it in a conventional method by setting up a small number of well-established survey points and then sighting on buildings over long distances and then coordinating your data onto a map, because often sightlines were never more than 20 or 30 meters long. So we moved from point to point using very old-fashioned surveying methods to produce a plan. And we really didn't know what the city looked like until we'd finished the map, because if you walk around in this forest, you just move from tree to tree, from building to building, and you very quickly lose your bearings. And getting an overview of how the whole city looks was only really possible when we finished our plan. Like most Pisidian cities, it seems to start round about 300 BC, 300, 200 BC. The fortification walls probably date back to that period. And then it flourished in the Roman period, when, as often happens, the main public buildings were put in the lower parts of the city, the more accessible parts, rather than on the fortified hilltop, which is, as it were, is in front of me as I'm looking roughly eastwards. During the Roman period, monumental buildings appeared in some numbers, and we are actually I am standing in the Agora, with behind me this imperial monument for emperors of the 3rd century AD, on which there would have been statues at one point. And I'm looking at a row of 3 small temples which faced the Agora from the other way, with a number of large statue bases which would have carried inscriptions which are almost completely illegible today. There are 1 or 2 letters you can make out on some of them, and would have carried statues. So this was the monumental centre of the city. It's very small, it's very compact, maybe 30 meters by 20 meters, but packed tight with monuments honouring local people who made good, paid for these buildings probably. And then behind me, we're at the edge of the built-up part of the city, and there's a very well-preserved cemetery with large built tombs, smaller sarcophagi, combinations of sarcophagi, a very complicated and extensive necropolis where the richer people of the community were buried. And interestingly, among them, a well-preserved church right in the middle of the necropolis, which is probably the earliest Christian monument of the site, perhaps dating as early as the 4th century, when Christian churches were initially built outside city centres, because in the city centre there were already public buildings and temples, and Christianity wasn't yet strong enough to take over, as it were, the city centre, but they put their churches in cemeteries, sometimes, and that might be true here, associated with the tomb of some early saint or some martyr or some local Christian leader who'd been buried in the pagan cemetery and then became an object of cult, and the church was built close to, or indeed incorporating, that grave. We can't prove that that's the case here at Sia, but I think it's quite likely the reason why the earliest big church is outside the city in the cemetery. I worked here in 1995 and 1996 with a team of Turkish and English and archaeologists, including the British Institute's present director, Lut van der Put, who worked on the Roman architecture that we found here. We were, yes, it was the sort of a fairly experienced Pisidian team by that time. Lut was a veteran of several earlier seasons. Sabri Aydal again came and did the topographic map for us. We had a couple of German students from Münster, as I remember. I had some of my own students from Swansea University in England, in Wales I should say. Those were busy seasons for us because we in fact worked on 3 sites more or less simultaneously: the Deux-Chemin-Bois, which we've just been to, the Sia, also did some work at Ariassos, which is not so far away as well. And those were the last 2 seasons that I did in Pisidia, covering the southern Pisidian cities. When was I last in Sia? I have been back since '96, but I'm struggling to recall which year it was. It might have been in the early 2000s, I think. I think Sia's, it remains a reasonably well-kept secret, and so it does feel very much as it did back in the 1990s.